So, David, how are you doing?
I'm all right, yeah. It's not too bad. I mean, considering we're, 24 hours out, less than 24 hours, so nerves aren't as bad as they were about a week ago.
Yeah, would you be nervous about it a little bit, or...?
Well, yeah, so I'm married to an American. My son's got a passport from 2 countries. I study the US, what I do.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you're kind of emotionally tied up with it in a sense, even if you're not from there, and you're kind of a little bit more protected over here than you would be elsewhere. But yeah, still, this is the 3rd election in a row that's the most important of our lifetimes,
Yeah, that's true. That is the 3rd one. Every single time it gets more and more important.
It ratchets up, right?
Yeah. I do have the first question I do have to you, and this is kind of linked to it. Tell us in what way you deal with the US and US history in your daily life.
Okay, yeah. So I said there's the personal stuff, right? So my scholarship, I'm up in the Department of History. I do a lot of work on American foreign policy, on the American military. So that's a lot of what I focus on in terms of just thinking about how the US military works in the world, how US foreign policy works or doesn't work. But then, you spend time in the US. I'm over there a fair bit doing research. Spend a good bit of time in Pennsylvania, actually in Carlisle. So my wife's from Ohio. So there's that sort of professional connection to the personal connection as well,
Oh, really? Your wife's from Ohio?
Mm-hmm.
Does she eat dogs?
She's vegetarian. She was born in Alaska though, so she's got this extra connection to.
Oh, brilliant!
Yeah. But she's a vegetarian, so I haven't seen. Yeah, I'm not sure sort of what meat she's eaten recently. But yeah.
And as a professor of American studies, what does that entail? Would you be studying politics, history? What do you mainly look at?
Yeah, so for me it's history. So within American studies, some people are very into lit or film or whatever else. But for me, I'm a pure historian. So what happened and why, right? So I teach classes on the Vietnam War, which obviously connects to we talk about political conflict and stuff like that. Mm. And then instead, a lot of what I do is then to do foreign policy. So that's kind of where I fit in.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I get into the questions then, and we'll see what we end up with. The first one I have for you is: we're a day from the election that has often been described as the most divisive election in American history. How would you categorize the political climate in America today?
Yeah, it's up there. I will say, we're talking before, and a few people about civil war and stuff like that, and the environment is pretty bad. I will say, for just a bit of perspective, if you go back to 1860, 1861, where the real Civil War happened, that was worse. I don't think it's cold comfort, right?
Yeah.
But you go back to 1861, where Lincoln was coming to be inaugurated, and had to go in the dead of night on a secret train, lest assassins get him. So we're not quite at that level, but we're pretty close to that. We're not right there, but I mean, you just look at the news, right? Just look at the way people are behaving. It's extraordinary, right? It hasn't happened in a long time. Where's that level of friction and that level of passion,
Yeah, that's very true, and that's actually what I want to build up on, because I feel like looking back at past elections, do you think this year really stands out that much, or do you think there's other years that would be nearly on this level, or even as you said, the one when Lincoln got elected, that was even worse? Was there other ones that came close to it?
So I would say, Lincoln 1860, that's hugely important because that is the Civil War, right?
Yeah.
So Lincoln doesn't win, things go differently, slavery endures. That's a big deal, right? So a lot of historians would say there was a second American Revolution in the 1860s after slavery was abolished. So that's a huge deal. But at the same time, I remember when I was going back 8 years, I was teaching class on the Vietnam War, and that was a contentious time too, right? There's massive protests. There was, the war is not a popular war. And I remember saying to my students, calm down. This is not 1968. 1968 was bad. I would say now we're beyond 1968 in terms of
really?
How bad it is. Yeah. And I think look, there was violence in 68. That's definitely true. But I would say if you look at the candidates involved, and I'm not a fan of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was one of the worst presidents in American history. But he wasn't openly contemptuous of democracy.
Yeah.
So I think there's a bar. And
not openly anyways.
No, I mean, privately he said something on the tapes that are pretty bad. But I do think so I was talking to someone earlier about this, in 2016 you could say, right, you can understand maybe how Trump gets in, right? Various things that were happening there. But 2024, what he said about what he's going to do, right? And the best case for him is you don't believe he's going to do it. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I would say it's up there just because of what's at stake.
And I find that interesting because that's kind of what I want to get into, because to me, that's the most interesting thing about this is that 2016 and this year is the first time that there's someone who was a reality TV star, who was a known public figure, but who had no political background besides a few talk show appearances or a few statements in newspapers, is actually running for president, won the first time. And what, in your opinion, how has American culture evolved to that point where a prerequisite isn't even more having a history in politics, it's just being a known figure?
So there's a couple of things. I think one thing, and it's hard to acknowledge this, is that Trump has a rare political talent. And I mean that like seriously in the sense that he saw something that other people weren't seeing about the way the US is working, right? And he made a bet on political sentiment, and that was actually like that vision. And I mean, I don't mean to use the word vision in a positive way. What he saw, that took a certain vision, and I think he's a fairly historically unique figure in that sense, right? And one of the things we do as historians, we say, right, well, how do you weigh up like the big tectonic plates, the shift, right? The whole the big events. Economics, things like that, or this chance and contingency that, like, something happens, that, someone gets out of bed the wrong side one morning and the world changes. And I think with Trump, it's a bit of both, right? So there's his political talent, his ability to see something that others didn't see. And then you have, you can talk about deindustrialization, the really poor recovery in the 2008 recession, how much political trust was destroyed by the Iraq War, how much political trust was destroyed by the Great Recession. So that's the kind of environment he came up in a sense.
Do you think there maybe was a bit of frustration as well in the American public of because that's what I always hear, and that's from friends over in America where I hear this often, where they get very frustrated with how clean and like washed out politicians were in America. I'd always felt like it was very rehearsed speech, and then Trump would go onto a rally and he would just riff for an hour and he would say crazy, wild shit, right? But I think do you think people maybe found that refreshing in a sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And like you can think about this in terms of like how people think with Trump and the truth, right? Because he's obviously lying, right? All the time. He's always lying, right? But you say to his supporters, and okay, the very extreme end, they're like, oh no, whatever he says is gospel. He's a godlike figure. Most of them go, yeah, he's bullshitting. But you know what? There's a deeper truth there that he's willing to acknowledge. Yeah. And I think that's a big talent he had. And on the flip side of it, and they're very different politicians, I'll give Bernie Sanders huge credit as well. In 2016, Sanders was doing the same thing. Yeah. And you see how popular Bernie was for a very different political project. So I think you're totally right that ability to seem to be straight, to be authentic, that's a really rare talent.
Do you think maybe it's the sense of being fed up with the party politics as well? Because before he came in, the Republican Party was kind of like the Democrats. They were very united in that way, where it was like us against them. And then once he came in and once he won the presidency, suddenly it was all about him. And even when he would say things that the party wouldn't agree with, they would kind of shift to stand behind him. Do you think maybe a frustration with party politics played part in it as well?
Yeah. So a couple of things there. So one, I think Trump destroyed the Republican Party. Yeah. He basically realized it was an empty vessel and took it over. Yeah. And it's amazing the degree to which he did that, right? You look at like who the chair of the RNC, the Republican National Committee is, it's his daughter-in-law. It's a family enterprise now, which is amazing. And I think he did do that because the parties got hollowed out over time. So if you look at, look at Germany, right? We skip ahead to a different continent. You look at the SPD in Germany, right? Yeah. They're also hollowed out, right? I mean, they're dying a death as well. But they were coming out of a world where you lived with the union, right? Yeah. You were a union guy, you went to the SPD club afterwards, whatever else, and that was the social world in which people lived, was they lived in a kind of a dense world of like, I'm using academic language, but like dense social networks. They knew each other, they trusted each other. Trump is a world of very low trust. People don't trust anyone anymore, right? You don't have the same social connections, people are atomized, and in that sense, political parties are weaker. Political parties, people volunteer for them, but they don't mean the same thing they used to. And so in that sense, there's a mistrust of political parties. And he was able to use the decayed state of the Republican Party to just completely take it over, like in a hostile takeover. Yeah,
that's a very interesting point to me, because I only learned about this recently, but I learned that a lot of the founding fathers were actually against party systems. They would write like warning messages of like, if parties take over, it'll devolve into a two-party state, which I found very prophetic, because that's happened now. Do you think that that basically because the parties took over so much power, that kind of preempted Trump, that's why he was able to do?
Yeah, so the founding fathers thing is interesting because, you're totally right. You read the Federalist Papers and they're writing each other, parties are bad, we shouldn't do parties. The Electoral College which is now helping Trump, was designed to stop Trump. You read it, they were saying, well, we're going to elect these wise guys and they're going to make sure these demagogues don't get elected. That hasn't worked out in reality. But I think the problem isn't so much that political parties exist, it's the American Constitution isn't designed for them. Yeah. So if you look at the way the Constitution works in terms of, let's say, I'm getting into the nitty-gritty, but like the Senate is, Wyoming is 2 votes, California is 2 votes. That's highly anti-democratic. They have the filibuster, which means basically you need 60 vote threshold to get anything done. So all this machinery set up to slow things down, to get compromise, whatever else. But in a world of actual political parties, that doesn't work because the parties have no incentive to work together. So I think there's something interesting there where the founding fathers designed a vision for the Constitution, the political machinery, based on one set of assumptions, and where we are now in the 21st century is nowhere near those assumptions. So that's a huge problem, and that's what makes me kind of pessimistic in the long run with the US. Like, how do you fix that constitutional machinery that is not designed for the century? You know,
and that's very interesting to me, because I'm glad we're getting into this, because I find the historical background of it so interesting, how the country was set up to kind of prevent this, but ended up enabling this. And maybe in a way, this ties into my next question, because I find that with Trump and with this new era of highly publicized politics over there, that the interest in American politics has spiked massively in Europe. Like, I remember the first time I ever heard about Bush growing up was when he started the wars in the Middle East. The first time I ever heard of him, never even knew who the guy was. I knew who Trump was from the second he started running. Why do you think that interest has spiked so hard? Why is media coverage spiked like that?
It's a great point, and it's funny. Like, you'll see Irish people talk to them tomorrow, and they'll have opinion about DeKalb County in Georgia, right there.
Yeah.
But, the vote count, the level of detail is absurd. What they know. And I wonder, just a question for the room: how many of you guys know who is on the Irish Supreme Court? How many you could?
I thought you were going to put your hand up like I am. Me.
How many you could name American Supreme Court justices? Few. You're right. I mean, the Americans could, obviously, but so we know something about the place, right? We're drawn to the place, right? And actually, in a very simple way, it makes my job easier as someone who teaches American history. People flock to it. I think, in one sense, the stakes are higher, right? We can see now how existential it's getting for us. The other hand, and we can talk about this if you want. Like, Trump is entertaining, right? He's good,
absolutely.
Right?
And I think that's something that plays a huge. It's the WWE fucking factor of it. It's that people watch the debates now, and usually debates would be very boring. It'd be policy against policy, and now you have Trump calling someone's wife ugly in a debate, and suddenly it becomes way more entertaining for viewers. I think that's a huge part of it too. I think maybe that's why we got interested in it. Would that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And he's someone from the entertainment world, right? He's not a politician. He's someone, he made his money in property, but not really. His big thing was a reality TV show star, right? And he's very good at that. So I think that's got to be part of it. But I do think, and maybe this is just an Irish thing, American culture does seep in here everywhere, right?
Yeah.
We grew up in Ireland my generation, watching Friends and stuff. So there's still that connection there that we have that we'll pay attention to them.
And that's even moving around a little on a larger basis, because the European Union and the States are so connected historically, originally the first settlers came from England. That's how it all worked. How would you categorize the relationship historically between the European Union and America?
I mean, it's a long relationship, a big one, but symbiotic, right? In the sense of it's a colonial offshoot of Europe. That goes its own way and eventually overtakes Europe and becomes the world power from about 1914 onwards. But that relationship with the US always looked at itself in relation to Europe. It always said, for a long time, comparing themselves to the Europeans. They've outgrown them, and now the Europeans are the ones looking to the US, comparing themselves to the Americans all the time. So that relationship is they're extremely close. Do
you think it's at risk? Because I hear a lot of Trump going the Europeans are stealing our money, they're blah blah blah. Do you think that maybe that relationship is more at risk than ever?
Yeah, I do. And look, in one sense, there's always been tension there, because every American president's you got to spend more in defense, blah, blah, blah. That always happens. But Trump means it. And he really, he does, we have good evidence that he was talked out of withdrawing from NATO, on the spot in Brussels by his advisors, right?
Yeah.
Those guys won't be there next time. Right, he's very sure of that. So that will completely wreck that. The relationship, there's always going to be tension. There is, right? They have different interests, they have different priorities. But with Trump coming in, there's a severance there. Even if you elect Giorgia Meloni, you elect Marine Le Pen, you elect the AfD, there still will be that disconnect in terms of priorities. And Trump has no interest in good relations with Europe.
That's it. I don't think, even if all the right wing parties win in Europe, I don't think Trump gives a shit who's in charge. I think he's gonna do the exact same thing. Yeah,
absolutely. He can be flattered if you're nice to me.
That's true. Yeah, he can easily be flattered. Yeah. The next question I really want to move on to is: do you think at this point is America a useful ally, or has it become a liability?
It's both, right? So in one sense, the sheer military and economic power they have, you can't underestimate it.
Yeah.
So if we go to think about Ukraine, for all of Europe's security priorities in Ukraine and stopping Russia from taking over the country, they couldn't have done it with the Americans. They just even now Europe's we're gonna build factories and 1 million shells a year. Still can't do it. So even in a declining US, we shouldn't underestimate the raw military power they have, and like that's something that's useful. And also, in a weird way, the financial firepower. So, without getting into too many boring details, like about 60% of the world's reserve currency is dollars.
Yeah.
So the dollar is the world's reserve currency. When there's a financial crisis, if the Fed turns on the spigot, countries don't die. So you kind of need them. Are they unreliable? Yeah. With the danger we now have, as you're looking at, if you're von der Leyen, you're going, right, who said it? Was a French defense minister said about 2 weeks ago, why do I have to give a shit what 100,000 voters in Wisconsin want to do every 4 years? Am I now going to base my defense policy on that? So the more of these elections we have, the more people will worry and start to do their own thing, I think.
Do you think Trump could have stopped Putin with a phone call?
Absolutely not. He would have waved him through. I mean, I think, okay, one thing about Trump I will say is he is very unpredictable in the sense that, like, he can be talked around very easily.
Yeah.
So I think he loves Putin. I do think it's entirely possible someone could have set him against Putin and said, that guy mocked your shoes or something, and that would have set him up. Who knows? That's dangerous too, though, right? That's not
he
not
said
great.
You're balding and the hair's fake.
With the hair,
yeah. Perfect. I want to get into another topic. I want to get into this, and this is something that I, as a European growing up in school, I've heard this term all the time. As America, as the world police. How relevant do you think that is today?
It's less relevant than it was. I already said American military power is like absolutely extraordinary, and it is, right? I mean, what they can do in the Pentagon is unbelievable. No other military in the world can match that, and won't be able to match it for a very long time. But you do have looking at China, what their shipbuilding program is doing. So if you look now in terms of where the crises are in the world, right? We got Ukraine, Middle East, South China Sea. There's 3 major crises, they're the top 3.
Yeah.
America right now cannot realistically deal with all 3 of them. And that's probably the first time in 30 years that's been true. So I don't think, one, there's the appetite.
Why do you think that is? How has that happened?
Well, in one sense, right, like other countries got bigger, right?
Yeah.
So very simply, like China's navy is now the biggest in the world. I'm not sure it's the most effective. So that means the Americans have got to make choices they didn't make before. So, you and I grew up, I don't know what age you want to ask, but like, if you didn't.
You can ask.
But you didn't grow up in the Cold War, right? We grew up after the Cold War.
No, I did not grow up in the Cold War.
Fair enough, right? You're not using the anti-aging cream or anything.
No.
So we grew up in a world where, like, what's the movie America, the world, what's the one?
Team America, World Police. America.
Yeah. Fuck yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the world we grew up in, right? Where they could do whatever they wanted. And that's been drifting away for a while. And the Americans know that. Like, they do know that themselves. So, one, the capability is not quite there despite their strength. And then 2, the will isn't there. Because they're saying, look what we did for 20 years in the Middle East. Where did that get us? And you're not going to see the enthusiasm. I was at a panel a couple months ago with a guy who was a fairly senior advisor in the Pentagon once. And he's like, yeah, well, when war comes with China, we're going to do it. And I was like, who's going to go to war with China for you? Who's going to do that?
Yeah.
So I think there's 2 sides to that. And so, yeah, look, they're going to be the world's military power for a long time, but they're not the world police anymore, and they know they're not.
Yeah, I want to build onto that because so the perspective on US interventionism and that sort of mindset of like we get involved in wars, we help the good guys win, that was kind of commonly accepted, even like with people living in Europe. I remember that being the common thing. Yeah, that's the good guys. That's the guys who help democracy. And I think the point where I started and where a lot of people started seeing it differently was the Vietnam War when that happened. Because I remember even like I was born way after that even happened, but I remember hearing jokes on the fucking Simpsons about how bad the Vietnam War was. Do you think that was a tipping point, and how do you think the wars in the Middle East have influenced the public perception on that?
No, that's a good question. So I think, one, Vietnam, absolutely a tipping point. If you look at sort of American public opinion, after 1941, the whole country is like, yeah, we're the good guys. Now, before that's divided. Before that, it's not quite. There's 2 sides before that, and there's about a 20, 30-year consensus that America are the good guys. All political parties agree. Vietnam happens, and that's totally shattered, right? Because it's very obvious. But there is a long project to rebuild that, right? It's to do with like, okay, we're not going to do Vietnam again. But you look at look at cinema, right? And you look at, let's say, the movies came out originally, think of Francis Ford Coppola, you think of Apocalypse Now, you think of all these really bleak Vietnam War movies. You think of Rambo, right? Rambo 2, is it 2 or 3 he goes back to Vietnam? And Rambo 2 he goes back to Vietnam.
Yeah.
And like, he says, do we get to be the good guys now, right? And that's that narrative was making a comeback in a sense. So the Gulf War, they're the good guys.
Yeah.
Right? George Bush says we get to finally bury the ghosts of Vietnam in the sands of the Arabian Peninsula. 1990s humanitarian intervention. So there's this sense of like, okay, actually maybe we are the good guys. And then the Middle East happens.
Yeah.
And there's like these flashbacks in terms of, are we really? I think that more than anything destroys kind of the sense of American goodness, and also I think American trust in public officials. The way it did in Vietnam too, right? The lies around Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, everything else, and in a weird way leads to the rise of Trump in a strange way.
Yeah.
Trump supported the Iraq War, but he says he didn't.
Yeah, is that necessary? Like the propaganda behind making sure the war seems justified, is that necessary in order to keep the mindset of your like infantry and your people on the ground? Is that why they do it? Because I've always been confused when they justify these wars that are, with a bit of research, seem very obviously wrong. How come they have to do it so heavily?
No, so if we're talking about the guys in the ground, it's a really interesting question. And I know a lot of guys who served in Iraq and Afghanistan who are very bitter about it, extremely bitter about it. They're not happy to serve there. They've lost friends. I'm sure they've seen things. I'm sure they've done things they've been told me about. What's strange though is like, you're right. On the one hand, there's propaganda of what we're doing over there is good and 9/11, blah, 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 blah. On the other hand, with the professional military, it's different, right? And one of the things I look at is the growth of the professional military. You look at, say, World War II, right? You have a whole army of propaganda there necessary to tell guys it's a good war. And kind of was a good war in some ways, right? But if you look at Saving Private Ryan, right? Thinking of the Tom Hanks guy, what's his name? Captain Miller, I think, is the Tom Hanks character.
Yeah.
Right? And he's an English professor. And he just wants to go home. He's fight the war, he's going to go home. And he's a normal Joe Soap. He's kind of pudgy. He's not a Sylvester Stallone type. You fast forward to the Iraq War, these are professionals.
Yeah.
And their life is this. And if you've seen the movie Jarhead, which is a really, really good movie. Is it Jarhead or no? It is Jarhead. And they're having a debate about politics in the back of the truck in Kuwait, and they're going along and they're talking about oil and whatever else. And I forget which character it is. It's one of the sergeants is like, stop all this shit, right? We're here. That's it. The rest is bullshit. And it's the notion of the band of brothers and we're here for each other. And that's what we're fighting for, which has limits, right? But I do think that with the guys who were fighting the wars in the last 10 years, certainly, what they were fighting for was each other. They weren't fighting for bigger cause.
Do you think they're being looked after sufficiently enough when they return? Because I always see that being a big point in America, where people will return from these wars and they're not being looked after enough. And they have all these big debates about homeless veterans and stuff. How did that happen? How can you make these people fight for a goal that you propagandize and then not take care of them when they come back?
Well, so there's two things. One is like the American social safety net's not great. Right?
Yeah.
So immediately you have people who will pay for wars, not too pushed about the healthcare afterwards. Now that does change. So in the Vietnam era, I've seen Born on the 4th of July writing those memoirs. This guy's come out of filthy hospitals, horrible conditions. That does change. There's a lot of money put into the Veterans Administration, and actually socialized medicine exists in the US for veterans and no one else.
Yeah.
But with the Iraq War, what you find is the huge issue they had there and Afghanistan was mental health. They had no idea what to do. And I know a good friend of mine wrote a really good book on it. He interviewed a lot of Pentagon generals about mental health in the Iraq War and the suicide rates they had. And they were just stumped by it. They could not understand. And so part of it comes back to, not that they didn't care, because at this point in time they had the money and they're pouring money into it. But it goes back to the mental health issues in Iraq and Afghanistan where like, what are we doing here? Why are we fighting the war?
Yeah.
And that's really hard. Like, you can't fix that with better healthcare. These guys have this trauma because they went over there to do something that like they didn't believe in ultimately, and that's what you see, huge suicide rate amongst veterans.
Yeah, that is very well said. I want to just kind of quick fire 3 ongoing wars or 3 recent wars and their impact on the election and the 2 candidates, Harris and Trump, how they reacted to them. If that's okay with you, we're just kind of quick fire 3 of them. We'll see how the first one obviously is Ukraine. Very interesting the way that Trump talks about it, where he talks about his relationship with Putin, and then very interesting the way Harris talks about it, where it's maybe a bit more focused on the actual on the ground issues. What is your perspective on how Ukraine has influenced the debate?
So I think Ukraine it's not been a decisive issue in the election, but it's been interesting to see polarization playing in there. Right? I remember years ago saying, Putin made a massive mistake back in Trump because of course the Republicans are always anti-Russia, so that's going to backfire.
Yeah.
I was totally wrong. Yeah. So I think that's been interesting to see, and I mean obviously there's a huge risk for Ukraine now in terms of what happens in a couple of days' time if Trump gets elected. Harris, I think she does look at it though. I think she is also worried about long term what's going to happen there. I think she's going to continue the Biden policy, but I do see her hoping within 6 to 9 months that they're going to try and push some sort of deal there. I don't know how they do that with the way he is, but I think she's going to try. I don't think they're going to do kind of 2-3 or more years. I think the patience isn't there.
What about the movements in America where people are very into cutting off all aid to Ukraine? Why, in your opinion, what is your opinion about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. And I think part of it is, it's very simple. It's a very simple message, right? Why are we sending the money over there if we can't afford X, Y, and Z here? It's wrong. It doesn't work that way.
It's reductive, but it's effective.
Yeah, it's very effective. And you can, and then if you get into, I'm a professor, so I'm going to, well, it's complicated, and I'm 14 sentences deep, and they've wandered off to
right?
Of
course.
So you can see how that takes hold, and if there is massive social need in the US, not that Trump is going to fix it. Trump's going to tax cuts to billionaires. We know that, but the message can be, well, we'll put, like, it's like we were talking earlier. Someone of Brexit. 350 million pounds going to go to the NHS.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of situation. It's reductive. It's a very easy message. So you can see how it's taken hold. And certain politicians, they amplify it. J.D. Vance is a huge fan of that policy. And the more it gets repeated, the more people buy into it. It's not a majority by any stretch, but it's enough that if Trump gets in, that's going to be a danger.
And then the next one I'm going to talk about is I want to talk about the humanitarian crisis in Palestine a bit. And especially what I find fascinating about it is that there's a large part of normally Democratic voters who are currently undecided. I think the last one was over 150,000 who cannot vote for Harris because they feel like there's no alternative option to someone who supports the ongoing strikes against civilian targets over there. Why is that happening? How has that come to be?
Well, I mean, I think it's a really interesting issue. And like, look, in fairness, if you were looking at pictures on your phone every day of dead children, killed by American bombs, you can understand how someone would look at that and go, I can't support this.
Yeah.
And that's totally understandable. If you're in Michigan, you're an Arab American, you've been the subject of all sorts of propaganda. Let's say, for instance, Rashida Tlaib, the Democratic Congresswoman in Michigan, has been subject to ridiculous slander. So you can see how someone would recoil against that, just naturally to say, like, that's unacceptable. Now, what I would say to follow through on that, though, is that's an understandable reaction. I totally get it. What I find a bit, again, understandable, but I find less convincing is someone has that reaction and say, I just can't vote for that. And then they say, maybe Trump would be better, which is just absolutely untrue. And the second thing is, well, maybe if the Democrats lose, maybe we'll push them left. And I can guarantee you, if the Democrats lose the election, they will not be swinging left, right? That's not the lesson they will take. They'll build a wall or whatever else.
Yeah.
So, like, I do get it. I totally get it. I just think the consequence of that, in terms of Trump victory, will be far greater.
But where's that unwillingness come from to not budge on the topic at all? Where does it come from? Because I haven't seen either Trump or Harris ever budge on it at all.
As in, why no greater support for Palestinians, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I do think Harris had room to do something. I do think she did. I mean, even, I'm not saying symbolism matters here when you get people being killed on a daily basis, but even in the Democratic National Convention, they had the option of letting one single Palestinian speak.
Yeah.
And they were afraid to do it, right? And I think that's just born out of total caution. It's also deep in the DNA of American politics that support for Israel is totally bipartisan. It's very, very deep. I would say my guess is Harris she has to be more skeptical than Biden, because Biden's extraordinarily pro-Israel, even by Democratic standards.
Yeah.
I think she's more like Obama in that she's somewhat skeptical of Israel, but I think she's being very cautious and playing it safe. I'm not sure it's a good idea. But I'm guessing it's just a sense of like, well, if I do this, and what if I lose 200,000 voters in Pennsylvania over this? It's not the bet I would make, but I kind of get why she made that bet.
Okay, yeah, that is very interesting to hear. And I think we're going to stop talking about Israel now, because this is being recorded and I am German and I have a career. I want to get into a few topics before you wrap this up. The first one is Shannon Airport. It's the big, and I kind of want to bring this back to Ireland now and how this affects this country, because Shannon Airport is always the big topic of discussion. It's always, can you explain exactly what's going on there? Why is that such a hot topic at the moment?
Okay, yeah, I mean, Shannon, it's a hot topic for nearly 20 years now, right?
Yeah.
Since the start of the war in Afghanistan. And look, I have friends who worked in the bar in Shannon and said, like, once upon a time, they would sweep up after the American soldiers, and they're literally sweeping dust from Afghanistan into the bins. So, it's very physical and real. But it's just right now, the issue is weapons shipments to Israel. And the question of, are these shipments going through Irish airspace? Seems like yes. If so, that's breaking Irish law. Irish government doesn't want to particularly know about it, so I can totally understand why it's in the news in that sense. And it goes back to, the early days of the Iraq War, where we know for certain there were CIA rendition flights went through Shannon with, prisoners in hoods, in the orange jumpsuits, whatever else, going to torture sites in Poland and in Syria and Egypt. So, there's a long, fraud history there. I would separate out those issues from the troops in the bar drinking Guinness. I think they're not quite the same, but I do get why people are concerned about Shannon again.
Yeah, I think it's the thing again with effective messaging. I think the troops drinking the Guinness is just, that's the effective image, that stays. So is it, so do you think Ireland is bound to the US, or does it have enough independence? Because that's what I see people say about the Shannon thing, is that it's too much influence on Irish politics.
Yeah, I think we're very economically bound to the US. I think that's definitely true. If you look at sort of where our surplus or 27 billion euro surplus comes from, 14 billion, that's Apple, right?
Yeah.
We didn't want the money off them, but whatever else, whatever. But
no, they put it in a bank account. We get it eventually.
Yeah.
Don't worry.
Yeah. So I do think there's a fear amongst senior Irish politicians about if we know the Americans, corporate taxes go down, etc. Whether they're right or not, that's not a call I would make. I think they can take the risk. I think we've diversified enough. But that's where the fear is coming from. It's the Chamber of Commerce saying we can't afford this because we're so dependent on corporate taxes. Not exactly particularly courageous, but I'm pretty sure that's where it's coming from.
Yeah, brilliant. That's very enlightening because I always heard about it. I never really knew about it. I do kind of want to talk about the difference between the modern American politician and the modern Irish politician, because I find that very fascinating, because in America, politics at the moment is all about optics. It's all about visuals. And then in Ireland, I find it's a lot less about that. I was looking at the local election. It was the first Irish election I was eligible to vote. And some of the candidates would have headshots where they would take a selfie in their living room, with the Nokia 58. And in America, that wouldn't be not happening at all. What do you think is the difference between the archetypical Irish politician, the archetypical American politician?
Well, so far, the US presidential election, they spent $3.5 billion on that, right? So you can afford something better than Nokia if you've got $3.5 billion behind you, right? And I just think the amount of money, well, two things. The amount of money in the system is enormous. So therefore, you can afford to buy amazing things. And then secondly, it's just a bigger country, right? The Irish politician can knock on your door and they'll know who you are and know who your grandparents are. There's downsides to that, but that's, it's a much smaller system. I think
it doesn't mean the road gets fixed, though.
The road never gets fixed, right? But they know where the potholes are, right? That does help. Whereas the American system, just the scale of it as such, right? That even a congressman, you're talking about 70, 60, 70, 80,000 constituents in the House of Representatives, and that's going to lead to a different relationship with your constituents. And if you're the president, you're running around 7 states in airplanes. It's a totally different world, right?
100%. So that's the main difference there, is that this is just smaller scale, is it? Yeah, absolutely. Just before we wrap this up, my last question to you is, in a very succinct way, how do you think a Trump presidency or a Harris presidency will influence life in Europe, in Ireland for us?
So Trump, life, we won't notice it the way others will, right? Let's be clear. Ireland is not going to suffer the way other countries suffer. I think life gets worse. It gets more unpredictable. Climate change gets worse. That'll be slow, but it'll happen. It's happening anyway. I think the war in Ukraine gets far worse. I think the war in Gaza gets far worse. Hard to imagine though that is. Under Harris, I think we're roughly where we are in terms of, I think she won't be a massive break with Biden. So for what we will see here won't be a huge difference. But the Trump presidency Mark II will be much more radical, much more authoritarian, and much bleaker presidency. I won't say I can predict it. I'm a historian. I don't predict things. I said this happened a long time ago. It's safer for me to say that. But I do think it'll be a radical break in our politics, and in the long-term economic consequences could be pretty bleak. But it's hugely unpredictable with him.
Is there, and I just want to do this as to play a little bit of devil's advocate, because I have to sometimes do this. Is there anything positive that you could think come out of a Trump presidency for the European Union?
With the caveat that he's totally unpredictable, and we just don't know who he's going to be. I think hard one to think about what are the good things for us out of this guy.
Dave's about to storm the stage again.
The golf courses will do better, right?
Oh my God, this has been extremely educational. Thank you for coming on. I just want to say, as a German man, it's nice to talk about other countries starting wars. Thank you very much. David Fitzgerald, everybody, give it up.